Hi, everyone. A very big thank you for joining us this evening. My name's Ian Jankelowitz. I am on the board of Stand Up, one of the organisations that is co-hosting tonight. And I'm dialing in from the land of the Gadigal people and the Muru Orodeel people, also known as Randwick City Council. It's a real honour to be here tonight, and I'm really, really looking forward to tonight. I think the voice is one of the most, if not the most important votes that'll probably happen in our lifetime. And it's such an important opportunity to provide forums for our community to really grapple with what this vote means and to hear from multiple perspectives and points of view. While Stand Up has come out quite vocally supporting the yes vote, we do understand that the community has a variety of views on this topic, as we do on many, many topics in our community. And so we really acknowledge that it's important to engage with people from a variety of backgrounds and viewpoints, and that's something that's important to all of us here tonight and many members of our community that are unable to join tonight as well. So I did want to also just say a very big thank you to all of our panelists. We have people dialing in from the basement of wedding celebrations, from offices, people recovering from 21st birthday parties, not themselves, their family members' 21st birthday parties. And I think that the fact that so many people, so many esteemed panelists have made the effort to dial in tonight just shows not only how important they view this issue, but their commitment to the topic overall. So just a brief overview of the run of the night. We'll have multiple panelists speak and kind of provide their view from both a Jewish point of view and a legal perspective. And then there'll be a panel discussion that'll be facilitated by Rabbi Elton, and then people are also will be welcome to add their comments and their questions in the chat. So I am going to throw over to Rabbi Elton to take us from here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to Kol Halev and to Stand Up and everyone who's joining this very important discussion this evening. As has been mentioned, I'm Rabbi Elton. I'm the Rabbi of the Great Synagogue in Sydney. I'm actually in my office of the Great Synagogue as I speak, and I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the elders past, present, and emerging, because it is on their traditional lands that the Great Synagogue is built. And in fact, I also live in Darlinghurst, not very far from here. The voice matters a great deal to me personally and to the Great Synagogue as an issue which is facing the Australian nation. The Great Synagogue has always been deeply engaged in the issues which are relevant to all Australians, not just the Jewish community. We were providing members of the public service, either in terms of the judiciary or ministers or the civil service from the colonial period right up to the present day. And the Great Synagogue has always been very committed to creating a just, equitable, fair Australia. And the voice is one option, which is before us now, and how we're going to move towards that. And we are joined by three outstanding panelists. I will introduce them in detail before they speak, but just to give you their names: Rabbi Justice Marcus Solomon, who'll be giving an approach based on Jewish values and a legal perspective; Louise Clegg, who'll be putting forward a no perspective; and Marcus Stewart, a yes perspective. And what unites all of these three speakers, as well as I'm sure everybody who is taking part in this call this evening, is a shared commitment to Australia, to the best Australia we can create together as Australians, and to addressing the injustices and the practical difficulties which have afflicted First Nations peoples on this continent since European settlement in the 18th century. Everybody wants to bring about the best improvements and the best resolution to the problems, both in principle and in practice, that face First Nations communities. What we're dealing with tonight is a very serious disagreement about how that can best be achieved. But we all have great confidence in each other's bona fides, good faith, and sincerity in seeking out the best way forward for us all. And that is, I hope, and I'm sure, will be the spirit of the conversation, certainly amongst the panelists, and I hope also amongst those who submit questions on the chat function, which will be selected to be put to the panelists by myself after they've given their individual presentations. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting, very important, and very respectful discussion in the hour and a half to come. So allow me at this point to introduce our first speaker, Rabbi Justice Marcus Solomon. He was appointed to the Supreme Court of Western Australia on the 4th of August 21. He became the first rabbi to be appointed a Supreme Court Justice in Australia, or indeed anywhere else. He started by reading law at the University of Western Australia. He commenced his legal career in 1991. He completed his articles of clerkship at Dwyer Durack, and from 1992 until 2000, that's where he worked. He became a partner in 1995. From 2000 to 2006, he worked at Gardens Lawyers, where he was managing partner. And in 2006, he joined the independent bar. He was appointed a senior counsel in 2013, undertaking a wide commercial practice until his appointment to the bench. He remains a teacher of Jewish studies, senior rabbi of the Bet Midrash of Western Australia, an institution which is dedicated to advanced Jewish studies and Talmudic law for both children and adults. He is a governor of the Carmel School in Perth, where he's a highly respected rabbi, teacher, and thought leader for that community, and indeed the whole Jewish community of Australia. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Rabbi Solomon to open proceedings this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Elton. Can you confirm that I can be heard, Rabbi?
I can hear you.
Yes, let's hope that goes for everybody else. Well, good evening all, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I've been asked to speak for about 10 minutes. That is a tall order because this is a very complex and difficult issue. But I'm going to start with a couple of disclaimers. First of all, as a sitting judge, it's not only not my role, but really quite inappropriate for me to be suggesting to anybody whether they should be voting yes or no. So I'm not going to take a side in this debate. My function really is to give some reflections about the Jewish perspective of the issues which the referendum throws up for our consideration. My next disclaimer is that follows on from that, and that is that I don't think really a Jewish law or Jewish values, so to speak, mandate a position one way or the other. And therefore, not only is it inappropriate for me to express a concluded view, but it's not possible for me to express a concluded view about what Judaism would say about such a complex issue. My third disclaimer is that I'm speaking in a room underneath a dance floor at a wedding. And so if there's a thunderous noise, that's unlikely to be applause for what I'm saying. It's more likely to be something that suggests I should shift position. So please excuse me if there's any sudden noise. So let me come to immediately to the issue of Jewish perspective. And there's been a fair bit of press about Jewish values, and people have written various things, some of which have garnered some media attention about what Jewish values are and what they might say about this complex issue. My reading of those is that people have an entrenched political position and wade their way through Jewish literature in order to find selected cherry-picked parts of Jewish thought that confirm their own view. We all have a tendency to do that, but what I want to do is return to some perhaps basic and authentic Jewish values and leave it to you to consider how they might impact upon your thoughts on this issue. And really, the topic is so vast that I can do no more than perhaps highlight a few of the issues this evening. But the first thing I want to say is, as much as I don't think Jewish values mandate a position, there is something that I think ought to be said, and that is there's been a bit of press given to the expression of a view that the proposal, the subject of this referendum, is inconsistent with Jewish values. in my view, that proposition is plainly wrong. It simply cannot be said on any measure that this proposition is inconsistent with Jewish values. That doesn't mean you should vote yes, but it certainly doesn't mean that Judaism requires you to vote no. And I want to perhaps say a bit more about that in the discussion about Jewish values. So the first thing about the Jewish perspective is a fairly obvious one. And that is that the Jewish people plainly share a history of dispossession, of persecution, and discrimination. And no Jewish person with any knowledge of the Jewish life experience can be anything but overwhelmingly empathetic to the plight and position that First Nations people find themselves in today. I don't think there can really be any controversy about that. There are, however, obvious differences between the Jewish experience and the experience of First Nations people, a subject on which I am no expert. But I have had some dealings with First Nations people. I acted for a few years in the 1990s for two Indigenous tribes in the Pilbara region, which was a very enriching period of my life. And now is not the time to discuss the differences, but can I just perhaps invite your consideration of one? The Jewish people, throughout their years of exile, of persecution, of dispossession, were able to sustain their spiritual heritage, which grounded their sense of self and their sense of identity. In my discussion with First Nations people, history has not been that kind to them. They have, in a very quick period of time historically, been ripped from their spiritual and cultural heritage and thrust into a system in which they had no experience and no knowledge. And the tragic consequences of that are before us. And again, I don't think that's controversial. I think that's simply a fact that we confront in this country and a blight on our nation. I don't expect that that's really anything new to anybody or controversial. But turning to Jewish values beyond that limited but shared experience, there are a couple of things I wanted to focus on. And they're the things that have been the subject of of some of the media discussion and articles. Much of the debate, the respectful debate rather than the silly debate, if I may say so, has been about equality before the law and preferment of one group of people within Australia on the basis of race or on the basis of anything. And I know I've read many of Louise Clegg's very intelligent and articulate and respectfully argued pieces, and I imagine that she'll say something about that this evening. It has been said that equality before the law is a fundamental Jewish value and always has been. And that, of course, is true. But equality before the law is a very complex and nuanced notion. And the law does not treat everyone equally all the time in all circumstances. But again, a very complex matter that is well beyond the scope of this evening's and certainly my short presentation. But I want to invite consideration of the Jewish experience in this sense. The Jewish people were dispossessed from the land to which they were indigenous. That is the land of Israel. When they came back to that land in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century, they set up a legal system which was enshrined in various documents and continues to evolve, as we know from the very contentious issues that are happening in Israel now. But the fundamental document was the Declaration of Independence. I'd invite you as Jewish people to have a look at that Declaration of Independence, because what it really does is that it recognises the special role, the connection that the Jewish people have to that land and the connection they have to that land historically and the persecution they suffered after dispossession from that land. in returning to that land and re-establishing a sovereign state in the name of the Jewish people, the right of return of Jewish people to the land was preferred, and that is enshrined in the Israeli sovereign state. And so the notion, and that is provided for, granted equally to everybody. And so the notion that a people should be indigenous to a land and having suffered persecution and dispossession, they should then in some small measure or some way have enshrined in their sovereign document some preferment in order to reflect that indigenous connection and their suffering and persecution is not a foreign concept to Jewish people. On the contrary, it is one of the foundations of the state that the Jewish people resurrected after their own persecution and dispossession. Now, again, that doesn't mean you should vote yes. It simply means I'm saying this because I'm seeking to illustrate that the Jewish experience is not foreign to this issue, and that it is really, in my view, quite wrong to say that the proposal is inconsistent with Jewish values. I want to say one more thing about equality. And of course, it's a very powerful and persuasive argument to say that people should be treated equally. And of course, in ordinary circumstances, that should always be the case. It is a foundational premise of our justice system. But what does equal mean now? That's a difficult question. But I want to share with you one Mishnah, one part of the oral law. The oral law in the Ethics of the Fathers discusses different attributes and different attitudes to property. And the proposition is put that if you say that what you own is mine and what I own is mine, that's an evil person, a person who regards everything they had as belonging to them. But a person who regards what they have is theirs and what the other person has, in other words, if I say what is mine and what is yours, that is an average and noble position to take. However, the rabbis say in certain circumstances that can be called midat Sodom. That can be called the attribute of Sodom, as in Sodom and Gomorrah. That can be the manifestation of evil. Because if you impose equality on a system that is intrinsically inequitable, then all you're doing, is perpetuating inequality. And so one needs to be very careful, I suggest, about arguments that are based on, that appear to be based on the purity of equality, because sometimes measures need to be undertaken in Jewish thinking to redirect the balance to ensure equity within the broad sovereign state. So that, again, doesn't mean you should vote yes whether this particular proposal is the answer or the solution to the undoubted difficulties and blight that we face is a different issue. I'm simply pointing out that authentic Jewish values, as recorded in our own tradition, are careful about equality because it recognises that it's a very difficult and complex issue, and one can't simply resolve these issues by a sort of broad reference to the need for equality. There's much, much more I could say about that, including with reference to the dispute about judicial reform in Israel today, where equality is part of the dispute, but the time does not allow for it. I want to conclude with this, and that is the notion. It's interesting that the notion of a voice has been chosen as the measure by which this is sought to be advanced. And that is because the notion of a voice symbolically in Judaism is in fact the instrument of empowerment. We say the voice is, if you like, in traditional Jewish literature, going back to the Bible, the empowering tool of the Jewish people. Kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob. We associate Jewish empowerment with a voice, not with weapons, not with swords, not with guns. Historically, our weapon of empowerment, or our tool, not a weapon, but our tool of empowerment, was a voice. And so the voice has great symbolism in Jewish tradition and Jewish history. And of course, we're now coming to the period of Rosh Hashanah, where it takes on an altogether, a different type of symbolism. And that is the Kol Shofar, the voice of the shofar, which is the ram's horn, which is the voice of introspection. And I want to conclude with that, because that piercing and penetrating voice of introspection that we will hear over the New Year high holidays is designed to motivate us to think deeply about the problems that we face personally and about the problems that we share in the society in which we live. And in our penitential prayers that we say over this time, we take a communal position. We articulate our commonality with the society and community in which we live in confessing the problems that we face. They are all in plural. Ashamnu bagadnu. We have sinned, we have fallen short, because whatever deficiencies there are in our society, we as Australians share them together and must take responsibility for them ourselves and share in the burden of remedying those difficulties and those deficiencies in our society. So whatever you're going to vote, and you'll hear very eloquent arguments about it, can I invite you and urge you, when you think about the voice, think of the voice of the shofar that penetrates your conscience, perhaps your preconceived prejudices, and allow yourself to think deeply about how you can share in the burden and the improvement of the society in which we live.
Many thanks indeed, Rabbi Solomon. I'll be returning to Rabbi Solomon and indeed our other panelists after the end of all three presentations. We're now delighted to hear from Louise Clegg, who was educated at the University of Sydney, where she obtained a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws. Since 2000, she's been a barrister practicing at the New South Wales Bar, specialising in public law and employment law, and she's conducted over 100 federal court appeals and appeared before the full federal court, the New South Wales Court of Appeal, and in the High Court with leading public silks. She serves on a variety of boards, including the United States Study Centre, the Sydney Institute, and Country University Centre in Goulburn. And she will be presenting a perspective from the no side of the argument, and I'm very pleased that she's with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Elton. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you to Kol Halev. I pay tribute to you, being a yes organisation, but yet wanting to have a debate. We all know that debate is the lifeblood of democracy and many other things. So it's really terrific to be having a debate on this topic. I don't think there's been enough of that in the last 12 months. Tomorrow, as I understand it, the writ for the referendum will be issued, and that will set into place certain things under the Referendum Machinery Act. And we have 33 days until we vote in this voice referendum. And regrettably, I think it's a lose-lose scenario for our country. And that is because most people voting, and certainly people at the polling booths urging a yes or a no vote, believe that they have equality on their side. And yes, Justice Solomon is right. The focus of my advocacy has been about this issue of equality. So that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. But with the fact that everyone thinks that they have equality on their side comes the unfortunate problem in that the people on one side, or many of them, think that the people on the other side are racist. And so we're having those sorts of things thrown around. And I think that's very, very, that's a very sad situation, and it needn't have been that way. A couple of disclosures from me. First up, I like to disclose this when I'm speaking at events, and that is that I am married to a Liberal Party frontbencher. I'm married to Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. But my advocacy around the voice has been very independent of the Liberal Party and very independent of the No campaign. But I also like to disclose, and I think it is something that helps me understand how this will play out on the ground, in addition to being married to a politician and sort of having a sort of a chair right up the front about how the sausage is sort of made in Canberra, is that I grew up in Western New South Wales, and we now live in regional New South Wales. So most of my experience with Indigenous people has been with integrated or integrating Indigenous people. So I am still friendly with people I went to school with, and my children have been to school with and are friendly with, and my siblings are friendly with Indigenous people who are anything from solicitors to shearers to tradesmen and they are footy coaches and people like that in the community. So that's my experience of Indigenous people. And through the referendum debate, I've come to know some more political Indigenous people. But the reason I've been advocating a no vote in recent weeks is my concern about the impact of voice on integrated or integrating Indigenous people. And so, look, I guess I consider myself a moderate conservative, and quite moderate, actually. In 1999, I voted yes. And until recently, I was promoting a more minimalist voice, if you like. I didn't think it should be called a voice. I thought it should be called just a representative body that would be in keeping with our constitution, something that is not sort of so emotional and perhaps as not a slogan. I think that's a problem for this model. Even calling it a voice, I think, is an unwise idea because it politicizes what it is, and it will forever politicizes it. So look, my big problem with this is that it is what I consider to be antithetical to liberal democracy, and because at the core of liberal democracy is the idea of equality of citizenship and equality before the law. And specifically, this particular proposal, unlike some more minimalist proposals, entrenches a political right to Indigenous people, which does not exist for other people. Now, it is a fairly small right. It's a right to make representations, but it's still a political right in the Constitution that other Australians don't have. And I think that could be problematic for how it plays out in practice. And when I try to explain my what I want to do actually is explain the way I see this model in the Constitution, and then as it plays out in the Constitution, how I see it playing out in society, and particularly in rural communities where the support for the voice, as many of you would know if you've been watching the polling, is much lower. I've been following this debate very closely. In fact, I've been teaching constitutional law in 2014 when the model was starting to be discussed. And at first I thought, well, how would this ever work? This is a group right in a liberal democratic constitution. In liberal democratic constitutions, you will not find group rights. And that just simply means that it's a right for a group of people rather than individual political rights, such as the ones that we know that exist in the United States, for example. In the United States, they have entrenched individual political rights, rights of free speech, association, religion, property, compensation, etc. So we don't have those in our Constitution, those individual political rights, but we would be moving headlong into a group political right, which is really unknown in liberal democracies. The Canadian Constitution does have one minuscule group right, and it's actually for Indigenous people. But that is a right to a say if there is a proposal to change the Constitution, or 3 clauses of the Constitution that refer to Indigenous people. Now, those 3 clauses, or the 2 other clauses, I should say, don't provide any rights, and certainly no rights over and above other citizens. So that small, tiny group right in the Canadian Constitution has been invoked once since 1982 when that constitution was repatriated. And the reason we don't have group rights in liberal democratic constitutions is probably just common sense, because the needs of groups change over time. And so, for instance, in Australia, we have certain groups such as the Business Council of Australia or the Minerals Council, or we have trade unions and employer groups that lobby Parliament, and some of them are provided for in legislation and others not. But the needs of those groups change over time, and sometimes within those groups they don't agree, and so those groups will split up and create different lobbying groups, and different provision will be made for them. So I had an instinctive question about whether this would be possible and how it would work. And so I came to it as a bit of a skeptic. But then over the years, I was listening carefully, and I was very friendly with some people who were responsible for it, or for the idea and helping to move it through the political process. And I was quite influenced actually by Murray Gleeson's speech in 2019, a landmark speech on this issue. And he said that we could have a voice, and he set out the history of Indigenous people. And he said that it would not be revolutionary to have a voice or a representative body that made representations in respect of what the words he used in his speech, and you can find it on the internet, was in respect of special laws or in Indigenous affairs. So I could see that what the former Chief Justice Murray Gleeson had in mind was a very narrow voice. And I thought that would be something that, whilst it was still a group right, and therefore would be quite a big thing in our constitution, would nonetheless be safe. And I certainly wouldn't have a problem with it, because it was narrow, and it would be about matters directly affecting Indigenous people and only Indigenous people. So that's how I came into the debate. When I saw the model that was proposed by the Prime Minister at the Gama Festival last year, I was incredibly surprised, and I rang up a couple of my friends who are in the Yes camp and still in the Yes camp, and I did say to them, look, this is a big mistake. I hope it's an ambit claim, but because I don't think the Australian people will vote for this. And they said, well, why? And I said, well, because it's just too big. And by that, I meant too big in our constitution, and therefore too big in our society, because in liberal democracies, words in constitutions really do matter. And so the problem that I have with it in particular, and some of you will be familiar with it, is that it's a whole new chapter in our constitution, and that's quite a big deal from a constitutional point of view. All of our constitutional jurisprudence is very focused on text and structure, and so we have 3 chapters that set out the 3 arms of government in our constitution, and then a few other chapters concerning the states and the admission of new states and trade and finance. But other than that, we've got the Parliament, the executive, and the High Court. Now, I could see that by going into a new chapter, that this would have similar status to those three branches of existing government. And other distinguished academics have confirmed that. And in particular, if you're interested, I do draw your attention to a very, very polished and very values neutral piece of scholarship on this, and that is the contribution to the Senate inquiry, the Joint Select Committee by Professors Aroni and Gerangelos, some very respected mainstream constitutional lawyers, and they simply go through this proposed amendment and simply say how they see it in the Constitution. And they have certainly said that they see it as having equivalent constitutional status or similar status to the Parliament, the executive, and the High Court or the judiciary. So this is really significant. And the Yes case, I believe, and the government, I think, trying to play it down because it's such a significant new chapter. It looks like effectively another arm of government in the Constitution, and I think it will play out that way in practice. Now, it's not like the other arms of government. It's a novel, advisory, and unique, not only Australian first, but globally unique arm of government. And it's not just me who's used that phraseology. In fact, one of the architects and key movers of the voice, and a woman who went to Uluru to help at Uluru, Professor Appleby, has imagined it that way and spoken of it in that way. So it's a chapter in the Constitution, and it announces by declaration that there shall be a body, and that's similar language to the establishment of the High Court and the Executive Council. But the really big thing here is the political entrenchment, and it's an entrenchment for to make representations on matters affecting to make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That was the real problem that I had with it when I saw it, because I always thought it would be a narrower voice, but because it extended to laws of general application on all matters affecting Indigenous people. So, for instance, and using the words of some of the proponents, such as Professor Appleby and Professor Davis in The Australian, they said, for instance, that the voice will be able to speak to all parts of government and a wide array of agencies. And in another piece written by Professor Appleby and a colleague of hers, it will extend to the allocation of public resources, design of civil and criminal justice systems, fairly managing resource extraction, tourism and other uses of traditional lands and waters, and responsible environmental stewardship. So it's a law that it's a proposal that extends an Indigenous right to a say on things over and above other citizens on everything. Now, a lot of people say, well, what's wrong with that? It can't do any harm. And I'll indicate the sort of harm that I think it might do in a moment. But stepping back from it, again, it's proponents have described the significance of it as the body will, and this is Professor Appleby again, will be a foundational institution of state and provide an important reordering of the hierarchy of the state and a transformation in established constitutional institutions. It will provide a change to the structure of Australia's public institutions. This is Professor Williams and Professor Davis. It would provide a change to the structure of Australia's public institutions and redistribute public power via the Constitution. So this is an enormous proposal, and it will change the structure of our Constitution and change our, and I think change our society. Now, people say, well, how could advice or representations do any harm? And I think the voice will do a lot of good. It will certainly some good. Some of the advice will be good, but there's no doubt that when the government listens to the voice about matters that affect other people and takes that advice, it will affect the rights and interests of other Australians. Now, in my view, that will happen particularly in regional areas, and particularly, well, at least in the first place, as the voice gets going. So I ask you to imagine how people in Middle Australia might think about this when the voice is in operation. So the voice is likely to have 24 voice politicians operating out of Canberra. It will be another arm of government, and they'll be very engaged with the executive and with the Parliament. And we'll see that on a day-to-day basis playing out. I imagine they'll be quite vocal. Professor Davis says the voice won't shut up. And they'll be doing doorstops and having a say on things. Now, I don't think that Middle Australia is ready for that. I think I personally would have been ready for a body that was more limited and had a say on matters affecting just Indigenous people. But I do think that as this is a very political model, and it will be a sort of high-octane political model right in our national discourse, that when the voice starts to have a say about matters that affect other Australians, there will be resentment. And I think over time there will be discord. And in particular, as we've seen with the Western Australian heritage laws, it will have a real impact on the property rights of farmers, and it will have an impact on mining workers, because the voice is likely to be, and understandably, but it's likely to be quite a collectivist approach, and it will be likely to, in many cases, be a sort of anti-progress, I think. And to the extent that it is...
I might just jump in there. I think we've gone past 15 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So look, I'm sorry, Rabbi. I've had the time written down. I thought I had until about right now. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
So look, I, with a heavy heart, will be voting no on Saturday the 14th, because I am concerned about the way that it is going to impact on particularly rural communities, but more broadly in society over time. I do think that over time, the division that we're seeing now in the referendum campaign will become entrenched and continue, and that will be bad for all of us, but especially for our precious Indigenous people, particularly our integrated and integrating Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Our final speaker before we turn to the panel discussion is Marcus Stewart. Marcus Stewart is a Nira Illim bulluk man of the Tungara Nation and held the position of elected co-chair of the First People's Assembly of Victoria until July this year. With over 20 years' experience in a wide-ranging career, Marcus is a natural leader and highly regarded for his drive and commitment to achieve systemic and structural reform to improve the lives of First Nations communities and traditional owners in Victoria, and he'll be presenting from a yes perspective. Thank you very much, Marcus.
I nearly spoke and didn't get off mute, but I've managed it. But thanks, Rabbi, and really appreciate the invitation from Stand Up and being able to come along and have a conversation. I want to acknowledge and thank Louise for participating. I think it's important that we see both sides to these arguments, which is critical. We're in a conversation right now around nation building, but importantly, in my language, I want to say wawagi, wawagi wurang, liwik nugangaguk, wawagi yumagu, gurubuk nungojan. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, Wurrung people whose country I'm on. I pay respect to their elders, their country, and their people. I also want to extend that acknowledgement and solidarity to our Jewish community who for a long time have stood in solidarity with us through the deeds of Uncle William Cooper here in Victoria. So I want to firstly just acknowledge that. I'll keep my commentary quite short. I want to stick really to the facts around what this is. And really, I'd wrote this speech about 2 or 3 times, and I've decided more so to speak from a community perspective, from our community's perspective of what we're seeking here. And we know what we see and what we have on offer here is a unifying moment that we see. On the back of a successful yes vote, Australians will wake up and lose nothing. They'll go about their day. They'll wake up that Sunday. They'll make themselves a coffee or a tea, whatever they decide to do. They'll make breakfast. They'll walk their dog. They might go to a cafe. But for us, we've slightly moved the dial. A small and modest ask for an advisory body or a committee, and as it says in the 92 words, an advisory body that'll be known as the Voice. An opportunity for us to make representations on the issues that disproportionately impact us. And if we take a step back and think about some of the challenges that First Nations communities are experiencing right now, we know a recent report released by the Productivity Commission, suicide rates have gone up. Our young people, they're our future. Child protection rates have gone up. They're our future. We know we know life expectancy, 8 or 9 years difference between First Nations people or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our fellow Australian. We know infant mortality rates are high. We know if The Voice wanted to make a representation on some of our rural and remote communities, from what they hear about a lack of clean drinking water or copper in that drinking water that disproportionately impacts them and them alone, that there'll be an opportunity for them to make that representation to the government or the parliament of the day. Our parliament being our lawmakers and government being our policymakers. And I should also disclose that I'm married to a politician, and some of my commentary on The Voice or the representative body as I talk about it has put me on the couch many times from my wife, Senator Jana Stewart. But importantly, The Voice is there. What do we want to call it? A representative body. We don't know how many there are. They're not politicians. They're a voice to Canberra. They're there to provide advice on issues that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm no lawyer, and I just want to qualify that for the room. But we know that there's been strong views for The Voice in the legal fraternity. What we're asking is, and if I think about my experience leading a Voice as the elected co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, a democratically elected body, we've seen, and we can see, or if I think about our ability to make representations to Canberra, were non-existent. When I was leading The Voice, which was our own, as I said, representative democracy, we had no ability to have conversations in Canberra, to make representations on issues impacting Victoria, although it was supported by a coalition government at the time for regional voices and local voices. We were not heard, we were not listened to, and we were basically ignored. Now, that's my experience from a Victorian perspective. I'm not saying that's the experience across the country, but that was the reality that we were up against. What we see as the opportunity here is to, through a small, what I see and what we've heard through our community, a constitutionally enshrined voice, which is a small, modest ask, that can move the dial on outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the most disadvantaged in this country. We can't forget that. The most disadvantaged in our country. We can give them a better chance at life. We can give them the same chance at life as our fellow Australian. Now, we heard some comments around equality. One of the challenges we've always faced is treating people equally isn't equality in our community. We know over, you could look back over the 2 decades. We're spending, or government are spending, billions of dollars, and outcomes are getting significantly worse. And I spoke about some of those outcomes. So every Australian knows what we're currently doing isn't working. Now, First Nations communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, have said, we want recognition through a voice. So we heard of some of the absences or what's missing kind of in our constitution. We're quite familiar with what's missing in our constitution because we're not recognised in it. Why aren't we recognised in our constitution? Because it was built on the assumption that we would die out as a race. 65,000 years, as the Uluru Statement from the Heart talks about. Our culture will be a gift to this nation. 65,000 years, the oldest living culture on the planet, would be a gift, which is part of my story. But after a truly unifying moment, will be part of all our stories. And representation through a voice gives us an opportunity to reach into every corner of this great country to understand the issues from our community and thread the eye of the needle to make our system of government, our policy making and our law making on issues that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people better. We can start chipping away at the major issues that are impacting our community. All we're asking is for the government of the day and the parliament of the day to listen. And why do we want it constitutionally enshrined? Because this needs to be above politics. Too often we have seen representative bodies stood up only to be abolished because the government of the day didn't like what they heard or didn't want to listen. What we need is something that can focus on the long-term outcomes beyond political cycles, that can work with any government and any parliament of the day to improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's the simple ask that we're putting to the Australian people. Majority of the people, and not all the people, but a majority of the people that are pushing back really hard on this proposal are politicians. And why I want to make this point is the Uluru Statement from the Heart was a gift to the Australian people. Our community don't have trust in governments. They don't have trust in politicians. But if we think for a second, why would they? We've seen policy making over the best part of, 100 years that have been out to separate our communities, to harm our communities. And these laws, anyone can go and find out what they are, whether we're talking about the Assimilation Act, because to our community, you're either an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person or you're not. Whether you're rural or remote, you're a black fella in our terms. That's how we identify our community. We're a collectivist culture. So the opportunity that we have, and the reason why we put it to the Australian people, is governments have continually let us down, whether they be coalition governments or whether they be Labor governments. All governments have failed us. So we're putting this proposal through a referendum to the Australian people to let them decide of whether they need to send a message to our politicians that not only do they need to do better, but they need to be better, because the outcomes are harrowing. We know them. So now it's time that we can actually put a committee or a body in place, whatever we want to call it, or a voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that represent the community they serve on issues that disproportionately impact them. I'm happy to stop there, Rabbi Elton, and we can jump into the Q&A if that works.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Let me begin with a couple of questions which we received already from the chat, and then I might go into some others. So a question for Pastor Justice Solomon. I think there's some concern in the Jewish community that the voice might have something to say about international affairs and maybe involve itself in the situation in Israel. Do you think that's a concern that we should be concerned about?
Look, I'm not an expert in constitutional law. That would surprise me if that were the case, unless it was a matter in respect of which it impacted on First Nations people, the idea that there would be representations on foreign policy would surprise me, but I'd be keen to hear from Louise and Marcus Stewart on that. But my people whom I've read, people who are experts in that area, suggest that would not be the case. But again, I'm not an expert. The one thing I would say, though, is that I've seen repeatedly, particularly from one corner of the Jewish community, the suggestion that we ought to vote against this referendum because there are First Nations or Aboriginal people who are critical of Israeli government policies or are pro-Palestinian. You will find many people in the Jewish community who fit that description. Whatever the correct answer to the question you've posed is, the point I would wish to make at this time is that the idea of not voting for this referendum because within the broad community of First Nations peoples, there are people who perceived by some of the Jewish community to be anti-Israel, is a very poor reason and basis to make a decision. But I'd be keen to hear from the others on the particular question you've posed.
Thank you. So I'll open to Louise and then to Marcus.
Look, I think I don't disagree with any of that. Well, I agree with that, but I must say I don't know that there is such a proposal. I did read somewhere in the press, and I mean, you can't really know whether what you're reading in the press is correct or not, but I did see somewhere that there was a proposal to have a First Nations ambassador of some kind. So that there's a suggestion, but I don't know that that's really necessarily going with the voice. And so I'll just leave it at that. I agree with the judge.
Thank you. Marcus.
Just to Louise's point, there currently is a First Nations ambassador in place, along with our first, I think, Councillor General in Dallas, which was Benson Solo, appointed under the previous government. So we do have international diplomats, which I think their role is to focus on, trade opportunities and opening up different opportunities. I'm not sure, but just to be kind of really clear, the purpose of setting up this body is to address the serious and significant disadvantage that our communities are facing. We've seen for too long governments fail, and now we have an opportunity to move the dial on those outcomes. I can't see where the international affairs angle is coming from, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. A question also from the chat to Louise. How does a country, our country, that's trying to address the wrongs which have been sustained by a disadvantaged group, how can we do that while at the same time ignoring what, let's say, 80% of that group are asking for? How is it tenable to find a way forward which ignores the vast majority wish of the group that has been so disadvantaged?
Oh, look, I acknowledge the disadvantage, and I think, there are many ways we can do this without entrenching inequality for the first time in any liberal democracy. And we can address it by statute, or we could have a smaller entrenchment which didn't have potentially adverse knock-on impacts, political impacts. So, we can do all of that without the entrenchment. You see, I think the problem that people think that the no people are saying, "Oh, we can just ignore all of this." That's not the case at all. And again, I'm not an expert in Indigenous policy, and there are a lot of people around who are opposed to this. My problem with this is that this is a very political model, and the proponents of it say that they say, look, you don't need to worry about the entrenchment. It's the political power that it gives the voice. And I think Marcus just said, look, we need to entrench it to take the politics out. Now, we know what entrenchment does in the US. Political entrenchment creates discord and disagreement. We don't have that, and we're doing it for the first time for a group right, which is unprecedented. So my point is that if you make it political, then politicians over time become despised, and I think Marcus or the judge just said, these won't be politicians, but they will look like that operating out of Canberra because they'll be very visible. And so I know, being married to a politician, that the exercise of political power is unpopular, and so that my concern about this is that it's just too political. So we could do all of those things. We could certainly legislate the voice now for in the way that is going to be proposed and experiment with it. Look, I agree. Our First Nations people are very, very special. They do have unique status. I just don't think the way to solve that problem is to entrench a political right for them in a liberal democratic constitution.
Could I just ask for two follow-up questions on that? The first is just to this point about the 80%. How does it feel to you, as somebody who clearly cares about this issue, to be rejecting a proposition that 80% of that community are in favour of? That feels like a very tricky place to be. And second, in terms of the structure and the constitutional embedding of it, isn't it the case that, okay, the Constitution will establish a voice, but everything else is for Parliament? And Parliament, in fact, could vary it tremendously. Chief Justice Spiegelman said today in the Sydney Morning Herald, I think, there are precedents for institutions which were created by the Constitution, the Interstate Commission, which have sort of popped in and out of existence and taken very different forms. So it is still within the purview of the Parliament and legislation to vary that in ways that might address your concerns.
Yeah, so the 80%, look, I don't follow all this I'm just like everyone else, I read media, but that 80% has been quoted and re-quoted, but it was a poll that was taken of a particular group of people, and I think it's even been fact-checked by the ABC as not correct. And some other polling has sort of said there's 45% yes, and then 35% no, or maybe 25%, and then the rest they didn't know. Look, there's no doubt, for instance, that in Tasmania, the three big land councils are warring about the voice. It's a real problem for the Yes campaign because there's a view that only one group of them is going to get, some of them say that only one group is going to get into the voice. Look, I don't understand that well enough to follow it, but those are the media reports. I think there is a lot more disagreement amongst the Indigenous community, and it changes all over the country than some media would be telling you. But to former Chief Justice Spiegelman's point, I did read that very briefly this afternoon. Look, the Interstate Commission, as Gabriel Appleby and Justice Gageler and Michael Coper, all distinguished public lawyers, have pointed out, it sort of died because it had no friends. It was politically, and because the High Court invalidated a law that was made which gave it sort of dual roles. The Interstate Commission, some of its roles are now performed by the Productivity Commission, but it really did have no friends in Australian society. It wasn't really that interesting to people. And the point that Professor Appleby has made is, well, we could liken the voice to the Interstate Commission, but the view is because it is so political, the voice will always have friends. And because it is of its very nature so political. And I agree with that. It will always have friends, but it will always have foe. And it already does have foe. And this is the problem with this. It's politicising Indigenous identity, politicising anyone's identity in a liberal democratic constitution, I think, even if it is our most precious Indigenous people, it will end up badly for them. There was another question about the fact that the Parliament can control it. Look, this is a great question. I don't want to monopolise the time here, but it is true the Parliament will control the voice, but for the entrenchment. Professors Toomey and Williams have said that the entrenchment can't be done away with by the Parliament. So the right to say that very unique and sort of experimental right to make representations, which we have never seen anywhere else in the world, is still there. And it's the political nature of that will create the problems, I think. My advocacy has never really been about endless court cases and activist judges and endless litigation. That's not my shtick. I think the court should supervise this just a little, and that's probably what will happen. There will be litigation about it, but you can't take away the entrenchment. That's why we're here having this debate, and that's what I think will cause problems in our society, unfortunately.
Thank you. Can I just turn to Marcus Stewart and a couple of related questions? The Prime Minister said that the government or the Parliament can say no. Well, if they can say no, then what good does this enormous upheaval, if that's what we think it is, what good does it do? And won't that lead to pressure to move beyond this very modest proposal, as you described it, to something much more radical and being a step in a direction people don't want to go. So first question is, what if the government says no? What good then? And two, is this just a stepping stone to something much bigger and more radical?
No, thanks for the question. I just want to add something just to the previous discussion. One, we're not the US. Two, they're not politicians. I've just come out of serving a representative body, and I think I spent 2 and a maximum 10 days in the Parliament. And you know, 3, this debate, and not this debate, but this whole debate can't be about. I mean, it's really hard to listen as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person. Some of the debate is pretty horrific, and I agree with Louise saying that we have to have more, you know, spaces like this where we can have conversations. But this continual conversation about what people knowing what's best for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that is why we're in the position we are, and the outcomes are what they are. Legislated voices don't work. They haven't worked. They've notoriously failed because governments pull them apart and basically abolish them as soon as they don't like what they want to hear. There is nothing political about an enshrinement that simply requests our government of the day and our parliament of the day to listen. And to the point, over 80% of our community support this. Now, if we were not held to a higher democratic standard than any other Australian, you know, you wouldn't hear about that. But over 87% actually of our community support this change. We're always going to have disagreements. We're not a homogenous group, like any community. But we are having the conversations about what we see as the best way forward. And this is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have put to the Australian people, not to our politicians. Now, our politicians will have the responsibility, as how our democracy functions. They will have the responsibility to legislate its powers, its functions, its procedures, which is all documented in the 92 words of the question that's being put to the Australian people. In short, to your question, Rabbi, no. Our system of government is we elect our political leaders, both in our Senate and in our lower house. They're our lawmakers. We, through a representative body, committee, a voice, will put representations to them to enhance their policy-making ability on issues that disproportionately impact us and our communities alone. They don't have to take on that advice. All they have to do is listen, which will enhance their abilities to make the correct decision based on all the advice they get, including from our public service. It'll enhance their ability to make decisions to improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's a small and modest ask. We know from numerous different whether it's with our employment or whether it's at our local sporting and netball, footy and netball clubs, that when we listen, we get better outcomes. Government will be a significant beneficiary out of getting advice from communities that are impacted most, because we talk about the representations it may make, but we don't talk about how it'll make our system of government better on Aboriginal issues by its ability to go and seek advice from a committee, an Aboriginal representative body, a voice, what we choose to call it.
Thank you. Ian Yankelovich has a question, so I'll call on him to put it to the panel.
Thank you, Rabbi. I couldn't figure out how to ask it in the Q&A box. One of the things that was said was some concern about. One of the things that was said was some concern around the long-term implications of this referendum, and that we may not understand the impact that it has. And I'm just curious. It's a question for Louise. When I think back to vote that was held about gay marriage, I think there was a lot of very similar arguments made, and there was concern about like the implications that was going to have on certain populations. And I'd just love to hear your perspective if you think that that's occurred, or why you think that we should be considering this in a different way to how the gay marriage vote has played out.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Look, there's a big difference, I think, between gay marriage and this, and that is that gay marriage was about including people, about same-sex couples in something that everyone else could do. So I see that very much like so many of the entrenchments that have happened in America since the Bill of Rights, first entrenchments, and so many of the entrenchments since are about equality. So they're about, because our constitutions, especially the American Constitution, was not perfect. So abolishing slavery, bringing on people into the franchise, the equality clause, making sure black people could vote, and then women could vote, and then people under 21 could vote. That all happened in America. I think same-sex marriage, it wasn't an enshrinement. It was just getting permission from the Australian public to go down this route. It was amazing, really. I think that there were 40% of Australians who voted against it. So I agree there were a lot of concerns about that. But I think it's in a very different category. One, because that was about equality and including people in something. Two, it wasn't about an entrenchment and changing the Constitution. So we're just in a completely different sort of zone here. I mean, the Constitution is for keeps. If this goes into the Constitution, it's there forever. And so this is why we have the capacity at the moment for the Commonwealth to make laws for Indigenous peoples, but there's special laws. They are beneficial laws. The whole idea of those sorts of laws is consistent with the international human rights laws. They're known as special measures. They are supposed to be beneficial and temporary and targeted. And the idea is that over time, you would improve things. Now, we've still got a lot of improvement to do for Indigenous people. I think personally, I've noticed growing up in rural Australia and living in rural Australia where there are more integrated Indigenous people as a proportion in communities than in the capital cities. We've made huge progress on respect for Indigenous culture and integration and reconciliation, particularly in the last 10 years. I noticed that at local events and, smoking ceremonies and welcome to countries, there's really great acceptance of that. But I can see that slipping away now because people think that this will create a privileged position for people who they see in some cases already getting benefits. And that's, from people who live in the cities and who are well off, they say, well, what's wrong with that? And I share that view. But when you're not well off, and when there's disproportionate funding for medical services, when the non-Indigenous people aren't serviced as well as Indigenous people in a community, for example, those beneficial services are, they say, well, what's going on? And then they hear about an additional say on other matters. They worry about mines closing down and things like that. I think the voice will be quite active in those areas. I mean, we've seen that with the Western Australian heritage laws, which was sort of real overreach into the farming community. They just got the balance wrong on those. But I think that is where it will go. And that's why, so look, I just think it's a very different thing. I think you're right. There's not been much adverse knock-on impact from same-sex marriage, but this is constitutional entrenchment, and we've never done that before here in Australia. And no liberal democracy that does entrench things in its constitution has done anything like this.
Can I just pick on that point with a question, then ask you, Louise, and also Justice Solomon to address it? Could it be said that there's a flaw in your argument, Louise, that this is something unknown in liberal democratic constitutions, because they are not from societies which are the result of settlement, colonization and displacement? So liberal democratic constitutions of Britain or France or Italy have a totally different history than Australia. Australia's history is one of displacing the Indigenous people and disadvantaging the Indigenous people. And so it needs a different sort of constitution than one which might be suitable for a northern hemisphere country, where it's basically the same population with some people who have joined it, but nevertheless the base population is the same it's been since time immemorial. And just as in New Zealand, the Maori can opt to vote in the general ballot or in a special Maori series of electorates, that it is legitimate in a country with a different history and a different relationship between communities, and where some who were indigenous have been displaced, to have a different sort of constitution. It actually shouldn't be just a Western European liberal democratic constitution in exactly the same way.
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually we can look at all liberal democratic constitutions, but the ones we really should look at are America, New Zealand, and Canada. We are the only country that doesn't recognise in some way in those constitutions. New Zealand doesn't have a written constitution. It has the Treaty of Waitangi, but it's considered a constitutional document. Now, and then I told you, I spoke earlier about the Canadian Constitution. The American Constitution just sort of happens to mention Indians. It doesn't it's neither here nor there, and they're mostly dead letter provisions. The thing about, and all of those countries have some sort of recognition, so they acknowledge Indigenous people, and they also have some sort of treaty, historic one or a few treaties, which have worked both symbolically and in practical ways. And Indigenous people would say not sufficiently, but they have worked to ameliorate, I think, some of the dispossession and the in practical and symbolic ways. So we don't have treaties. Now, I have a view, and this is not shared by other conservatives, that treaty would be much better than this. I would rather go straight to treaty, and that is because treaty is extra constitutional. It's the subject of, it's a political compromise, and treaties don't. They're just a deal that's struck, and they don't elevate those citizens over and above other citizens. So to me, what is being done here at a sort of theoretical, and I'm concerned at a practical level, sort of leapfrogs all of those things. And a professor of political philosophy, Professor Duncan Iverson at the University of Sydney, has acknowledged this. So he said this is globally unique. And he's for a voice. He says, but we're ready for this. But he acknowledges that this is quite a big event in liberal democracy. So I think this is different to those other constitutions. I think they're ahead of us now, but I think this leapfrogs everything. And we'll see coming out of the Global Academy, if this passes, they will be saying, wow, this is big. This is a really watershed moment, because it entrenches identity politics or identity into a liberal democratic constitution in a way that those others don't quite do that. And I should say, the treaty in the US with the Cherokees, the Treaty of New Echota, that doesn't undermine the sovereignty of the US government nor the Oklahoman state government. It provides a big lot of land to the Cherokees there, and there was a big amount of compensation. Again, the Cherokees, I guess they're not that happy with it, but it is something, and it does seem to have ameliorated some of the problems.
Thanks very much. Can I just put to you, Marcus Stewart, a couple of issues that Louise has raised? Couldn't there be a problem, and actually something which should lead to real tension and conflict? You have farmers who have economic needs, you have miners and mine workers who have economic needs, whose livelihood, whose children's prospects depend on their being able to pursue their work in those areas. And the voice might shut down farming, might shut down mining in a way which is deeply damaging to those communities and individuals and families. Isn't that a danger that might come to pass?
No, it's a scare campaign. We have the most progressive cultural heritage laws in Victoria. We protect tangible cultural heritage, our song lines, our stories. We have the strongest relationships with farmers here. These arguments were rolled out to scare voters during the native title debate, and we need to rise above this. This needs to be a debate on its merits, not on the politics of it. And I just want to talk to one thing. Louise, I'm sure you mean it in the most respectful way, but talking to Aboriginal people as of being integrated or not is highly offensive. based on the Assimilation Act that was put in place, which was designed to breed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people out. Like a dual X colour code, if you had fair skin, so if you had my fair skin, you could be integrated into society, but your family couldn't. So that's highly offensive within our community. I know that's not how you're portraying it, Louise, but I just wanted to make that point because it's difficult to listen to. But I know you're
I'm sorry, Marcus.
Speaking to this in the most respectful way, and I do appreciate that. I also just want to touch on, Rabbi, that I know Louisa spoke about, it could be a more minimalist approach and what it looks like. We get one shot at this. This opportunity, this won't come around again. There's been, conversation around our mob, some support, some don't. Our communities don't have faith in governments. They haven't been good to our people, to put it diplomatically. 80+% have faith in the Australian people that we can put this to a referendum and that we can start chipping away, rolling our sleeves up collectively as Australians and as First Nations people in this country to start addressing the disproportionate disadvantage within our community. Now, I spoke a little bit about, equality or treating people equally. We hear a lot about treating people equally or under the guise of equality, but the challenge for our community is if you have someone down a 10-foot hole and someone down a 5-foot hole and you give them both a 5-foot long rope or a ladder, that's treating people equally, but it's not equality. You're not getting both people out of the hole. And ultimately, what we're looking to do through this whole reform and this opportunity is to provide everyone a 10-foot ladder. So our First Nations communities can get to the start line. So their kids have the same shot and same fair go at life as our fellow Australians. And anyone that would try and argue differently hasn't been out and seen the disadvantage or hasn't read the statistics. Like, they're harrowing. But sorry, Rabbi, I didn't answer your question. I just wanted to clarify and make those couple of points.
And I think you did at the very beginning, so that's fine. I'm going to wrap up in 90 seconds exactly. So maybe I could just ask Justice Solomon and Marcus Stewart and Louise Clegg just to give us a 30-second conclusion. We'll start with Rabbi Solomon and then Louise and finish with Marcus.
Thanks. I've just changed position because I'm under the dancing has well and truly begun and I'm underneath it, a thunderous noise. But look, I'm just going to conclude with what I've just witnessed at a Jewish wedding, and that is, at a Jewish wedding, there's enormous unbridled celebration. And at the height of that joy, a glass is smashed to remember the difficulty and the destruction and the persecution that the Jewish people have endured, and that no joy, no happiness, no society is complete when others suffer. And it's not for me to say whether this is this proposal will address this meaningfully. I sincerely hope and pray that it will. Marcus Stewart and Louise Clegg are far more informed and eloquent about these matters than I am. But as a rabbi, I appeal to the Jewish people to remember the glass at a Jewish wedding. No happiness, no society is complete when others are suffering.
Thank you, Justice. Thank you, Judge. Louise.
Oh, well, who could disagree with that? I adopt all of that. Look, my concern here is that this is an overly politicised model that is too big for our constitution and our political culture. And I am therefore concerned about even though I will be voting no with a very heavy heart, I think it will be awful to vote no on this very sensitive and very important topic. But I am concerned about the long-term impact of an entrenchment of this magnitude. And so, as I say, it will be with a heavy heart that I vote no on Saturday the 14th.
Thank you. And Marcus Stewart.
Thank you. Ultimately, thanks for the opportunity to hear why. I mean, you've heard why I'll be voting yes, and you've heard why Louise will be voting no. I've explained that this has come from our community, heavily supported by our community, and we believe this can make the change that we seek to address the enormous disadvantage. But importantly, I'd ask people to go out and get informed, find out the information of what's being asked, have a look at the 92 words of the question that'll be put to you, have the conversation with your families and your friends. Ultimately, this has been a really heavy debate in this country, and I think Australians are starting to see exactly what we experience as First Nations people on a daily basis, even before the referendum. What's important is we have to keep our relationships through this debate. On the other side of the referendum, regardless if you have family that are yes or no, we can't sacrifice our relationships with one another on the back of this. We have to make sure we're there and where our relationships are intact. So the two key things I want to say is one, that, and two, go out and get informed and understand exactly what this is, and make sure when you stand in the solitude of that voting box and you decide whether you're going to write yes or you're going to write no, that you're well informed of exactly what's being asked of you. That's what's most important.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Kol Halev and Stand Up for putting together this evening's panel and discussion. I want to thank Shalom, our partners. I want to thank all our speakers, Marcus Stewart, Louise Clegg, and Rabbi Solomon, and everybody who's joined us this evening. I think this has been a real model of how to have a thoughtful and respectful exchange of views, lots of sincerity, lots of passion, and lots of intelligence as well. And I hope it helps us all better to vote, in the case of Jews, before the 14th, because it's Shabbat, in a way which is very well informed and for the betterment of Australia. I'm going to hand over to Courtney Winter-Peters just to say goodbye.
1 second. That better? Thank you, Rabbi Elton. So for those that don't know me, I'm Courtney Winter-Peters and I'm the CEO at Stand Up. And I just want to take another moment to thank our speakers, Louise, Marcus, and Rabbi Justice Solomon, for creating the space for open dialogue. We really appreciate it. As an organisation, we clearly support a yes in the upcoming referendum. However, for tonight, we decided to lean into this as an opportunity to provide a discussion to show different perspectives. We recognise the importance of people feeling empowered with information as we head towards a referendum. To Marcus Stewart, I just want to say an particular acknowledgement that we recognise the toll this is taking on First Nations people and how heavy this debate has become. And we appreciate the effort you are putting in and consistently speaking up and speaking out. And to Rabbi Elton, thank you for supporting this event and helping it come to life and moderating with your expert skills and insightful questions. And to Hannah Hammerschlag, who's sitting next to me, our campaign manager for Kol Halev, who has also brought this event to life and ensured it ran smoothly and goes above and beyond for Kol Halev. And to all of you who have been here and engaged and ready to learn, thank you. Tonight, you may have heard new ideas, or perhaps you have questions that you hadn't thought of before. You still have 34 days to continue the conversation, to keep asking questions and to engage. We encourage you to look out for future events we'll be running as part of our Kol Halev campaign and to contact us with any questions. And you heard Marcus Stewart with the call out, have conversations with people around you. We don't want you to wake up the morning after the referendum thinking, did I do enough? Stand Up are proud to be supporting a yes in the upcoming referendum. As an organisation who will be celebrating 30 years next year, we're committed to both our Jewish values as well as what it means to be an ally. And we echo what Rabbi Elton said in his introduction, that our wishes are for a just, equitable and fair Australia. Being an ally means listening. We've listened and heard over 80% of First Nations people are asking for recognition and for a voice. These calls inspired us to launch Kol Halev proudly in partnership with the Jewish Community Council of Victoria. Kol Halev when you change just one Hebrew letter means both call of the heart and with all of the heart. It's the perfect reflection of the invitation from the Uluru Statement, a generous invitation from the heart to listen to the calls of First Nations people with our open hearts. Through the events we've been running, a consistent message has been that the voice to Parliament is the result of a hugely consultative process that culminated in the Uluru Statement from the heart. It is a small, modest ask and a generous invitation from First Australians to move forward as one collaborative Australia. As you heard Marcus Stewart say tonight, a successful yes vote will not see the broad number of Australians lose anything. But for First Australians, the dial would be moved slightly in order to address the serious issues of disadvantage being faced by First Australians. The voice is not a new proposal. It's part of a carefully constructed invitation. And whilst there are some uncertainties to be acknowledged with any change to the Constitution, we rely on the countless experts that have looked at this and given it support. Constitutional law experts, former High Court judges, peak Aboriginal bodies have all said this is necessary and it's safe. And now it's our turn. It doesn't have to be lose-lose, and it might even be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make a significant change. The Honourable Julian Leeser, a Liberal MP, recently spoke at a Kol Halev event. He's also a self-proclaimed constitutional conservative. He stated that he resigned from his position as Shadow Attorney General to advocate for the voice because there are some things in life that are worth standing for. And he thinks that our community, the Jewish community, this voice to Parliament is something that is worth standing for. It's now the month of Elul. As a community, it's our time to reflect. When we listen to the shofar, we are encouraged to deeply think about the problems we face personally, but as Rabbi Justice Solomon said, we are encouraged to think about the society and community in which we live in confessing the problems that we face, confronting the problems that we face. Ashamnu bagadnu. We are not asked to think about how we can do better for ourselves, but for a community. As a community that has had the opportunity to set up a thriving Jewish network in this country, I encourage you all to reflect on the calls coming directly from First Peoples Australia. I encourage you to think about what our role is on the path to reconciliation. As you heard Rabbi Justice Solomon say earlier, we know that the notion of a voice is a symbol of empowerment. Hakol Kol Yaakov. On that note, thank you all for being here on a Sunday night, and I wish you all a Shana Tova.
Bye, everyone, and thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was really good of you guys to listen. Marcus, I'm really sorry that I upset you. I might have been able to put that a bit differently had I thought about it. I mean,
you didn't do it deliberately. I just wanted to make sure that at least I had the conversation. That you didn't do it deliberately, and I didn't take. I just wanted to make sure that you were, how that lands with Aboriginal people is quite devastating.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry about that. Okay. Anyway, nice to meet you, Marcus.
Thanks all. Have a good night.